Okay, how's it going, everybody? It's nice to be back. Another long wait, surprise, surprise. But I was on set for a couple of days and had a couple auditions and things like that. All good problems to have, but unfortunately, it means that some of this kind of fell to the wayside. So, to those of you who have stuck around, thank you very much. Anyway, today we do have the last 3 episodes of Junji Ito Maniac, Japanese Tales of the Macabre. Once again, it is still available to stream on Netflix. These last 3 episodes were all split episodes again, so there were 2 stories in each sequence. And for the most part, they were still pretty good. So in episode 10, we have the stories The Unendurable Labyrinth and then The Bully. This is probably the weakest of the last 3 episodes to me. Both of the stories in this one fall into that category of Junji Ito's story where it's kind of all premise and no real payoff. In The Unendurable Labyrinth, a couple of girls discover a monk's temple hidden in the forest, and they soon discover that the dead and dying amongst the monks form a weird labyrinth tunnel beneath the temple. They discover that they're trapped inside this creepy labyrinth, and that's it. That's kind of the end of the story. Creepy imagery, interesting premise, but it doesn't really go anywhere with it. Too bad because there's a lot of potential, but oh well. Second in this episode, we have The Bully, and this is, I am positive now, my least favorite story out of the entire anthology. Even the very first story with the weird, gross, creepy siblings at least had the semblance of a premise. But The Bully is honestly just a pure exercise in hatefulness from beginning to end. A girl bullies a young boy that she plays with and then eventually ends up marrying him and subsequently bullying the kid that they make together. That's honestly it. It's basically just 5 or 10 minutes of cruelty porn. Then in episode 10, things do pick up a little bit with the alley and the headless statue. Alley is one of a couple of the Justice for Victims stories that we get in this final 3. In this one, a man rents a boarding house next to an alley and becomes acquainted with a girl who eventually confesses to murdering her family in that alley one by one. At one point, she actually tries to drop this guy into the alley, essentially to feed him to the ghosts of her family, only to have the tables turned when she eventually finds herself trapped down there, presumably to be put through a whole lot of torment. The second story in this episode, Headless Statue, was one that I have to admit did not necessarily get off to a promising start. I mean, it was still intriguing when you had the premise of this art professor who prefers headless sculptures turning up beheaded one day himself. But in the middle of discussing this, once his murder has been discovered, there's a sequence where 2 characters are walking across a room that is so cheaply and hastily animated that it's almost embarrassing. You honestly can't even make out details in their faces or hands. It's the animated equivalent of some of those sequences that you see in movies where characters are conversing even though the camera is very far away, and it always looks suspiciously like a sequence that was filmed and then dubbed in post, which in most cases it probably was. And this had that same effect, so it had me a little bit worried. But by the end, this one goes just like totally bonkers and manages to find all sorts of ways to be hilarious and creepy at the same time. Without giving the whole thing away, I'll just say there's one sequence where a female figure without a head is stalking someone, and as it's stalking someone with a cleaver, it very deliberately jiggles its butt and shakes its hips in a very sort of stereotypical bimbo fashion, along the lines of something that Art the Clown does at a similar moment in the first Terrifier movie. And as much as it is essentially lowbrow humor, it's so unexpectedly goofy and silly and just off-kilter that it gets a laugh. Just an awesome little sequence. And then finally in episode 12, we have Whispering Woman and Sochi's beloved pet. Whispering Woman is the second sort of Justice for Victims, Revenge for Victims story that occurs in this segment. In this one, a woman who becomes the caretaker for a young girl with mental health issues, but she's being abused by a guy who's essentially just a real vile leech of a human being, who eventually beats her to death, upon which either her spirit or her lasting influence on the young girl with the illness ends up turning this girl into the instrument of her revenge. And what makes this one kind of a memorable sequence, at least for me, is that they wisely keep it ambiguous as to how much of what happens in the end is the result of the young girl's mental illness or is genuinely a spiritual message and influence from the deceased woman. And then finally, to cap the whole anthology off, we have our last story, Soichi's beloved pet. In this one, an evil little boy, in fact, I think maybe the same boy from an earlier story with the nails in his mouth, abuses a cat and at one point goes as far as feeding the cat a cursed snake, which transforms the cat into a weird monster all its own that seems to enjoy dining on all sorts of Lovecraftian bugs, until it eventually decides to take a bite out of the little bastard himself, which cripples him and puts him in a body cast more or less due to a static electroshock explosion. This was kind of a weird one because tonally I wasn't quite sure how seriously I was supposed to be taking it. There's several sequences that are sort of creepy and intense, at least according to the visuals, but the music seems to be suggesting that we should be viewing it as more of a satire or a comedy, even though there's nothing funny about it really, aside from just how much of a little bastard this kid is. And then there's the dubbing for the cat. All the cat's meows and growls and snarls and just animal noises are so obviously a human doing a very bad impression of a cat that it's kind of unintentionally hilarious. It feels like the kind of dubbing you would expect to find on a YouTube video that someone uploads to their channel as a joke. But being an animal lover myself, it's hard for me to completely dismiss a story where an animal abuser gets some comeuppance at the end. I think that about does it. On the whole, I really enjoyed this anthology. I kind of feel like 9 or 10 episodes might have been better just based on the overall quality control that we get here. I think you could have probably eliminated some of the lesser stories and you would have had 8 or 9, or again, at the most, 10 episodes that would have been pretty well perfect. The anthology format is perfect for this material, it just needs to have a little fat trimmed from it. And if you're a horror fan, I would definitely recommend checking this out. None of the imperfections that I've mentioned at any point is anything that I think would discourage me from recommending it. I don't know if a second season is in the works or if it's even warranted really, but I wouldn't object, I would welcome that. For that matter, I wouldn't mind seeing Netflix dedicate an entire full-length feature to a Junji Ito story, or even a limited series around one story like they did with Castlevania and some other properties. That would obviously involve a little bit more effort and creativity than just kind of translating his work to screen as they have here. But I hope it happens because I think Junji Ito is one of those authors who, on the whole, has stories where even the lesser material has enough potential that with a little work you could spin it out into a full-length version that could honestly be a masterpiece if you did it right. Anyway, it feels good to put a pin in that one finally. Thanks for watching if you've stuck around, and I will have more content coming your way as soon as I can. Have an awesome day, guys.